Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dorothy Wong, and I'm director of the East Asia Center. So, welcome to another uh, lecture of our speaker series. And I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Sonya Lee. Last summer, I had the opportunity to join a group of scholars and graduate students visiting all the sites in Tibet. It was really exciting. And Sonia was one of our academic leaders, so I got to learn a lot from her. And so it's really a pleasure for me to invite her to come and give a talk. Unfortunately, she can't visit us in person, but hopefully sometime in the future she will be able to do that. Uh, Dr. Sonia Lee, she received her PhD from the University of Chicago. Currently, she is Associate Professor of Chinese Art and Visual Culture and also Director of East Asian Studies Center at the University of Southern California. She has published widely on the material culture of Chinese Buddhism. Her first book, Surviving Nirvana, Death of the Buddha in Chinese Visual Culture, was published in 2010. She was the guest editor of a special issue for the Journal of the History of Collections, published in 2016. The essays examine Asian art collections in museums in relation to conceptualizations of the Asian continent during the 20th century. In her forthcoming book, Cave Temples of Sichuan and Chongqing in Ecological Art History, Dr. Lee explores art, heritage, and ecology in her analysis of Buddhist sites with monumental cliffside carvings in southwest China. I understand her talk today, Island Illusion Recreating Avalokiteshvara at Mount Putuo in Sichuan during the Song-dynasty China, is part of this project. So please welcome Dr. Lee.
Well, thank you, Dorothy, for this very kind introduction. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. Before I start, I would like to extend my thanks to Dorothy, to Brian, and to the East Asia Center at University of Virginia for giving me this opportunity to share my research with you. So for today's talk, I have decided to discuss the Buddhist deity Avalokiteshvara, a topic that many of you in the audience might be familiar with thanks to Dorothy's own research. As you know, this is one of the most popular deities in East Asia. The name in Sanskrit means the Lord who looks down in empathy, which echoes perfectly Avalokiteshvara's role as the Bodhisattva of compassion, a universal savior figure. So when this deity was first introduced to China, his name was translated as Guan Shi Yin, or preserver of sounds of the world, or gradually became Guan Yin, and so perceiver of sounds, and which again speaks to the deity's compassion and also magical power to intervene on behalf of anyone who calls on for his help. So today, I will focus on one particular form of many forms that Avalokiteshvara takes, and it's associated with a site called Potolaka, and I will have my PowerPoint up now. Oops, sorry. Go. Get my pointer out too. So I'd be focusing very specifically on the Avalokiteshvara image associated with this particular place. So Potolaka, for many followers in China, meant a very specific location along the coastal region of Shanghai. The name of the island is called Mount Putuo. And as you can see from my photograph that I got from Google, it's a pretty mountainous island, and it's off the coast just outside Ningbo. So that has long been identified as the Chinese Potolaka. Now, the emergence of Mount Putuo as the Chinese Potolaka was a slow, complex process. It's been the subject of many recent studies, including those by Junbang Yu and Marcus Mingenheimer. In today's talk, I will instead turn to Sichuan on my map in the southwestern region, where we find actually a number of really interesting images of Avalokiteshvara made during the 11th and 12th centuries that were meant to recreate Potalaca in that region. So we will not look at anything from this region, instead in the southwest. My main example is located at a cave temple site called Nankan Caves in the northern Sichuan city of Bazhong. So as you can see on the screen, the Avalokiteshvara image here appears on one side of a freestanding rock, which is separated from the main cliff face, maybe about 15, maybe 20 some feet away. And if you look more closely, you see that there are actually quite a number of images of Avalokiteshvara or Guanyin on it. So, one of the reasons that I want to focus on this set of images is that it can actually provide a very different perspective on the emergence of Mount Putuo as the Chinese Potalaca. That's something I will talk about later in the talk. But it also gives me a really interesting way of also looking into this long history of using a particular site's topography for symbolic representation. So if you can see, if you look at this rock here, it gives the impression that it might be some sort of island in the middle of a sea, and so it's being used very symbolically by the users. And at the site of Nankan, in fact, if you look through its long history, you realize that these type of natural features were often being appropriated for this very purpose. And so that gave the users a chance to connect the local worlds beyond through metaphors and illusions. So besides this rock, which is called the Mountain Gate Rock, that's something we'll talk a lot about today. There's another natural feature that's very popular among users over the centuries. There was a giant cedar tree, which flourished at the site for hundreds of years, starting in the 8th century. And it was the subject of many poems left behind by visitors to the site, and all the way until its collapse in the 12th century. So there were scores of poems that were on the subject. So as you can see, Nankan actually has this very long history in the use of nature as a metaphor. And I relied on these materials, so mainly inscriptions in the form of poems written by users, as a way to explore visitorship at the site. And so this particular episode from the Song-dynasty, which center on this rock, represents one of many such episodes of visitorship. And it also forms a very nice contrast with later times, when the site no longer was a religious center, no longer a place for cultural tourists to visit for leisure, but instead became a protected cultural heritage property and also part of a destination for red tourism. And I'm not kidding you, because if you look at all the monuments at the site, so the Buddhist cliffside carvings are all the orange part, so Mountain Gate Rock is what we're looking at, and there are a couple other places. But if you look further up top of the hill, you'll see that all these monuments dedicated to the Red Army. And Bazhong actually has a very interesting history starting in the 20s and 30s as a hotbed for Chinese communism. It's just that that branch of Chinese communism then went out when Zhang Guotao felt when he was competing with Mao to take over the Chinese Communist Party. Anyway, so it has a very interesting history, and I've written about it in other contexts. Now, the changing visitorship at Nankan is one of the key examples I use in my forthcoming book to explore how cave temples have redefined the way its visitors think about and also interact with the ecosystem of which the site has become a part after its establishment. So here is, in case you're wondering how it fits within my bigger book project. So I have an entire chapter dedicated to all these different episodes of visitorship. And so I just gave you a preview. And as you can see, this very fundamental question of how a cave temple site changes the way its users interact and with nature and also make use of nature. It's actually the major theme. And I explore that from 3 different stakeholders groups. So one chapter is about land use and site management. So as you can see, it's from the manager's perspective, and then so we have the visitor's perspective, and then one chapter is about the restorers of these carvings. And I'd be more than happy to tell you a bit more about the book in the Q&A session. And so this question about the site's impact on users' way of interacting with nature it's very central to my discussion. And one very simple and direct question I asked is, what does sustainability mean to them? And in the case of Nankan, so for visitors who came to the sites over the centuries, it's really the site's uniqueness, the specialness, not only as a religious place, but also as an ancient site that has been sustained through very specific kinds of activities, such as continual visitorship and also sponsorship of new images and also restoration. And so, so that's in some way the background to what I will talk about today. Now, so I will first introduce you to the site, and then more specifically to you about the mountain gate rock, and then I will talk about the Avalokiteshvara image on it, and then and also the connection to other images, similar images in Sichuan during this time period, and then finally talk about the region's connection to Mount Putuo on the coast. Okay, so here you're looking at a picture of the main cliff face at Nankan Caves. So as you can see, the site has a lot of different units. And just for those of you who are not familiar with its location, so I have this map showing you the different routes, the transportation routes connecting Sichuan with central China and also other parts. So as you can see, Bazhong is located along a major one called the Mitang route, which is actually along the Mitang Mountains. And that really would take one from Chang'an or Xi'an all the way into the main city in Sichuan, that is Chengdu. And so Bazhong is located right there. And I have to apologize, I just realized this map does not show the Chu River, which is actually connected to the Bao River, which is right next to the city. And so if you take the boat from along the Chu River all the way down, and so it will take you down to the city of Hechuan, and then from there you can actually take the boat, continue all the way into Chongqing, and that's to the Yangtze River. And from Yangtze River, you can go to the lower Yangtze region, river region, and also to Chengdu through the main river. And so this is actually a very important location along both the land and the river routes. And so the importance of Badong is often being compared to Guangyuan, which actually have a very similar setup. And so instead of the two river, it's the Jialing River. So as you can see from the map, Badong has long been associated with officials and also merchants traveling from central China down to Sichuan. And so we also see that being reflected in the inscriptions that have survived. And I would say that more than any other sites in Sichuan, we have a really rich archives of donor inscriptions. And they're actually really well preserved over the years, thanks to a massive wooden frame structure or shelter built in front of it that have helped preserve both images and the inscriptions. And from this, we actually can get a pretty good sense of the history of the site through this timeline. So as you can see, some of the earliest carvings can be dated to about early 7th century. And so we have a lot of inscriptions starting with the 8th century. And so these coincide with new images. And then starting in the 8th century, you also see images about restoration. And so, so that actually gives us a very good understanding of the purpose of the site. And so the rock that we'll be focusing on dates to the late 12th century. And this marks a very important episode because starting in the 13th century and all the way down to the 16th century, the site was more or less abandoned. So it was like a last burst of activities before the later period. And so this is actually quite interesting. And I also want to call attention to some more recent developments. So, Badong, it's one of the few places where you see a lot of activities that took place in the early 20th century. And many Guanyin images were actually made, and I will show you one that I really like in particular at the very end. Now, how does this timeline map onto the plan, the site plan? So a lot of the early niches and images are concentrated along the main cliff face. It's called a model slope. And then, and also a little bit in this slightly remote location called the Avalokiteshvara rock. And then you also have some burial caves associated with monks. And then when we switch to the 12th century, plus or minus 100 years, the Mountain Gate Rock was a really important part. And then also along this area called a cloud screen rock. So it's almost like a natural wall in front of the main cliff face. And so it's very hard for me to capture this in photography using conventional lenses unless you do panoramas or you do a fisheye to really capture the unique topography. And so the Mountain Gate Rock in many ways is located in between these two formations. So without further ado, let me now turn to the rock itself. So this is a photo I showed a bit earlier, taken from the cloud screen rock. And so you can see it very clearly. And I also want to call attention to this setup here. It's known as Cave 25. This is where a lot of the literary productions have been preserved in inscriptions inside this cave. So there are no pictorial images except on the outside, but the interior is entirely covered with these inscriptions. And so that's actually very interesting. And so this is a view of the rock when you walk up the staircase, and you can see that there are, so this is the main image we're focused on. That's from the late 12th century. And then you also see others actually added in the 20th century. So here's another view from sort of outside near Cave 25. And so you can see that this is also a Guanyin or Avalokiteshvara image dating from the late 40s. And this is another view sort of taken from that angle. So you can see this is literally like an island, um, a optical illusion of an island, even though there's no water unless you count the rainwater on the ground. So now let's turn to the one particular image that I would like to focus on. So, so according to the numbering system, it's known as niche 10, and it's simply titled Avalokiteshvara. And from the inscriptions left behind by the donor, we know that it's dated to 1174. And this is actually a pretty typical Avalokiteshvara image, in the sense that it's a freestanding figure by himself, and with one hand over sort of touching the other, and but the other hand is, I believe, is holding on to the sleeves, and and if you look more closely at the bottom, you see these circular engraved lines, which gives you impression of actually waves in the sea. So this is not, this is very intentional. And the main connection to Potalaka actually happens in the title. It may not show very well in this particular image, but I do have the inscription translated here. So, so this is the translation of the title. So the sympathetic luminous peak of Potalaka. So that's what it says. And I just read through it very quickly. So on the right side, as you can see, it's a lot longer than the one on our left. So we read, call this Avalokiteshvara because it was first carved by artisans. Call this not Avalokiteshvara, even though the form has come so close. For the one with complete perspicacity and utmost utter freedom, there's no limit to delivering any prayer. Once an idea arises, he who senses the train of thought would appear anywhere. We now make this image especially to thank all in heaven. Who doesn't have parents? The truth is more enduring than the rocks of this mountain. We bow deeply to the King of the pure and holy, who has been part of the mountain for tens and thousands of years. Whoever comes to venerate would understand that existence and non-existence are both wondrous accomplishments. And it's dedicated on the 20th day of the 6th month in the Chunxi reign, 1174, of the great Song, by the South Ba County commander Yang Gai, in honor of his deceased father on the anniversary of his death. So the connection of to Potalaka, it's firmly established in the title. But I also want to call your attention to the content of this inscription. The author here clearly relies on various contrasts of the extreme, such as being versus non-being, permanence and impermanence, man-made versus natural, to expose the rigidity of dualistic thinking. So you can see that's in this line. So as many of you know, dualistic thinking has long been decried by Buddhist practitioners as a major hindrance to enlightenment. By presenting the Bodhisattva on the mountain gate rock in this way, the visitor is guided to look beyond the face value so as to recognize the purported illusion of the image as the Avalokiteshvara at Mount Potalaka. The imaginary landscape was described in detail. In other Buddhist texts, such as the Vihaha section of the Apatamsaka Sutra or the Flower Garland Sutra, which relates the visits of a young man named Sudana to the Bodhisattva's island abode. So this is one of the first major references to Potalaka in Buddhist canon, and so that's where we got the name. Now, many people have since speculated on where exactly this is located, and some people believe that I would say that according to Xuanzang, it is a island in southern India. So there are also many other sites across Asia that has been identified with it. And so at Nankan Caves, this particular rock has been interpreted as such, and the setting was invoked primarily through this title. And I would also add that one particular form of Avalokiteshvara has been associated with Mount Potalaka, and that is the water-worn Guanyin that we actually have in Sichuan. So I will have some examples to show you. Maybe I will fast forward just for those of you who do not know. So this is actually a pretty classic example. So the Guanyin is seated on a rocky surface, one foot up, the other one hanging down. So it's supposed to be a royal ease, and then one hand rests on it, and then there's a giant circle behind, and then there's waves. So this is a unmistakable, very typical iconographic motif or configuration for Guanyin at Potalaka. But as you can see, at Bazhong, you don't get that. And so the main reference lies in the title. And I don't have the Chinese here, but the Chinese term, not Putuo, but Putuo Lojia. And so that's actually the earlier version of the name translated in Chinese. And that actually coincided with some of the earliest mountain gazetteers associated Mount Putuo. And so, so I have this illustration from sort of second earliest gazetteer dating from 1598, and you can see from the name, Putuo Lojia is the translation, and especially those first two characters. So you can actually see it here, and it is quite closely associated with some of the early references to this place. And so the fact that the inscription at Bazhong uses the older name with this combination of characters clearly points to a connection that I will explore a bit later. Now, in case you're wondering, what other Bodhisattva images, Avalokiteshvara images are there at Nankan? And so, in fact, there are actually quite a lot. I would say there are about 15 additional single figure examples of this particular motif. And the earliest one is what you're looking at on the screen. So it's dated to mid-8th century. And as you can see, it's a standing Bodhisattva image holding onto a water bottle. And it's a pretty standard rendition of Avalokiteshvara in the 8th century, not only in Nankan, but also in the whole northern Sichuan. And so I will call attention to some examples here in another major city where there are a lot of major cave temples, so Guangyuan. And as you may recall from my earlier map, it is located along the Jinniu or the Golden Ox route going into Chengdu. So here are some images of Avalokiteshvara from the earlier periods in Guangyuan. So you can see here's a figure holding onto a water bottle with a Bodhisattva outfit. And you can see that both by himself and also as accompanying figures. So this is from Tianboya, one of the biggest Buddhist cave temple sites in Guangyuan. And then for a slightly lesser one, and you can tell by the name itself, it's called Guanyin Ya, the cliff of Guanyin or cliff of Avalokiteshvara. You can see a lot of them. And so I'm just giving you one section of it. So many of them have the same configuration as those at Tianboya. So these are the early images. Now, what's really interesting about the relationship between Bazhong and Guangyuan is that Avalokiteshvara images flourished in both places throughout the Song-dynasty. But then in Guangyuan, all these activities slow down and decline to the point of basically no more new images added after the Tang Dynasty. Whereas in Bazhong, at Nankan Caves and also other caves, activities continue at many of the Buddhist cave temple sites. And so, so from the 11th, 12th century, we do have many of Avalokiteshvara images added, and mainly concentrating on the cloud stream rock formation. Now, I also want to provide some comparative examples of images from this part of the Southwest. So nowadays in Chongqing, the Dazhu district, and also a little bit into Sichuan proper, into a site called Piludong, because there are actually a lot of contemporaneous examples of Avalokiteshvara, and also specifically modern Avalokiteshvara from this area. So I have just shown this to you minutes earlier. So this one is dated, and this is from a site in Dazhu known as Zhemensan. And so it has the classic iconographic setup for the motif. So, so I don't have to repeat that. But I also want to call attention to the format of the niche, because it almost gives you a sense of of a picture frame, that one looks into this fantastical world through this picture frame in the form of a niche. And so, so it sort of retains that kind of otherworldly quality. And it's the relationship between the viewer and the image, it's more clearly defined. So the two worlds do not collide. The reason I say that is because in other places, the illusion of a Potalaka island, it's a lot more pronounced. So for example, we go to another site in Dazhu at Beishan, so cave 133, you see that it's the same water moon Guanyin, but it is set inside a much more deeply recessed space. So almost like a niche, and then nowadays they build a barricade so you can't walk in, but but still, if you look in, because of this sense of space provided by excavated space niche here, so the world of the viewer and the world, the pictorial world, the world of pictorial representation, it's getting more blurred. And the other example I have is located in Sichuan proper in Anyu County at a site called Piludong. And this is a very famous image because the local tourist bureau loves to use it to sell the site, even though it's pretty hard to get to from Anyu, sort of the urban main area. So you can see that the Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva is sitting on a rugged surrounding, and then it's elevated from ground. And I especially want to call attention to the whole setup, because this is actually carved out from the lower part of this giant rock, and it's basically supported by pillars. And so basically it allows you to really walk around, and even though it's not the best image possible, but being able to see the space in front is actually really important, because it really allows the viewer to walk from, say, this cliff face all the way around and to the other, give the impression that you're as if sitting on a boat, sailing around and seeing the Bodhisattva appearing on this island. And this is actually precisely how Potalaka was described, or Mount Putuo was described in some of the early surviving verbal descriptions of the site. So at Piludong, this is actually rendered this way. And so if we return to the mountain gate rocks at at Nankan Caves, this is sort of like the most three-dimensional rendition of the motif, in the sense that this entire rock is freestanding, and one can supposedly walk all the way around and experience Avalokiteshvara at Mount Putuo being created right there. Now, I would like to talk a bit about how do you explain this? And my main argument with respect to Mount Putuo's development along the coast is that I believe what you see here, it's actually a local response in Sichuan to this very recent development along the coast, that Mount Putuo had emerged as the Chinese Putuo. And one of the main connections that I see with Sichuan and also Zhejiang is that a lot of scholar officials have been traveling around, and they were likely responsible for transmitting some of the new developments along the coastal region further inland. And my evidence lies in the fact that in this later part of Nankan's history, you see a pretty significant shift from using the site solely for religious purposes, that you go and you create these images in honor of deceased relatives, to a period in which a lot of educated travelers would come to reminisce about the past, and also to also help support the local management by paying for restorations, and also creating some new images. And so a lot of the people involved, especially in this period where I'm circling around, were scholar officials. And and this actually coincided with a pretty interesting development in the Song-dynasty, and certainly is a really clear manifestation in Bazhong, where a lot of these travelers would travel to these sites with long history, and yearn for the past and mourn for the present. So the Chinese term for it is Huai Gu Dao Jin. So that's actually exactly being used, same term being used in the descriptions left behind at the site during this time period. And if you also look at the, going back to the earlier niche 10, the inscription, I mentioned that it was, the niche was commissioned by a military officer, Yang Gai. And so it also, he in many ways was representative of a lot of the people who travel around for officialdom, even though we don't know a lot about him, but from some of the contemporaries who did, who held positions throughout the country, it is not uncommon for many to travel to many different locations. And so I borrowed these two maps from Chong'an Jiang's book, Transformative Journeys, to show you two officials who actually spent quite a lot of time in both Sichuan and also in Zhejiang. And so on your left is Lu You, and so he's a little bit, they live about the same time period. And so you can see that Lu You spent a lot of time in Sichuan and also quite a bit of time in Zhejiang. And so if there's some new development happening, say you have this new island associated closely with Guanyin worship, and these people likely will bring it along. And then the same also for Fan Shanda, and he spent a lot of time in Sichuan, and then he famously undertook this boat journey from the southwest all the way back into the coastal region. And along the way, he recorded a lot of really great sites. And so So even though these two officials were not known to have visited Nankan, but we can imagine that there might be people like them who travel to spread the knowledge. And so if you look at the history of Mount Putuo in the early phase, there's not a whole lot of pictorial images associated with the site. So we have some scattered literary descriptions, both visitors and also Changmangs who visited there. And it's only much later, say in the Ming Dynasty, when there was a major revival, that we began to see a much wider dissemination. And so the images and the textual records from Sichuan actually provided us with a very nice perspective on this earlier period. And I also want to use this map to call attention to a really important mode of transportation along the river as a way to connect this two regions. And it's actually not as been extensively studied as it should be, because a lot of the people, goods, and ideas travel along the Yangtze River in the Song period. And so, as I mentioned earlier, once you get into Chongqing, you can take the Chu River all the way up to Banzhong. So it's done mainly by boat, and that mode of transportation supplanted the earlier land routes that connected northern Sichuan with central China. So that's why I think this is a most likely way of spreading the ideas that took place along the coastal region into the southwest. Now, to return to our main image, you'll be wondering about how do we characterize an image like this? Let's see, go back to just give it this. Okay, here. So, so far I have been arguing that this is actually a bodhisattva image representing the Avalokiteshvara at Putalaka as represented by Mount Putuo. But this is not exactly a exact translation of the original, because I would actually argue that this is actually in between, and two possible options. So one is an exact translation, just like Mount Putuo as a translation of Putalaka. But this is not exactly the case, because I'm arguing that it is actually a copy, possible appropriation of what's at Mount Putuo as opposed to the one in India. But this is not, but at the same time, this is not a in situ replica. So we do have that example at Mount Putuo itself. So, for example, the Brahman Boys Cave is supposed to be a full-scale translation or a equivalent of the original. So that's the Chaoyin or the tidal sound wave cave. And instead, this is sort of somewhere in between, and I would argue it to be this way. And so niche shelf at Nankan was, it's designed to evoke geographical and functional parallels to Mount Putuo, but it really didn't pretend to be the exact copy. And instead, for many 12th century visitors, this image might well have been regarded as efficacious as Mount Putuo in bringing about the Bodhisattva's manifestation. Yet the inscription has made it clear that it belonged to this particular mountain for tens and thousands of years and not anywhere else. So I'm just saying that this is an image created specifically for this site and not for any place. Well, and I will end my presentation here, and I will welcome any questions you have. And I would end with this very nice image of Avalokiteshvara made in the 1940s. Thank you.